Please welcome director Karyn Kusama.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for being here, Karyn, and congratulations on Golden Globe nomination for Nicole Kidman, Best Actress.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
It's there is so much that is unexpected in your film. It is supposed to be a crime thriller, a film noir, and then one of my first questions is that it's not shot the way that a film noir is shot, is bright, drenching sunlight in Los Angeles. Can you tell us about that?
It was always sort of in the script that the look of that part of what afflicts the character is just this relentless Los Angeles sunshine. And so I thought, my cinematographer, Julie Kirkwood, and I thought that it'd be interesting to actually really explore really bright light, so that when we had those moments of noir, nighttime, velvet silhouettes, it would give you a little bit of just like a visual relief. Mm-hmm. So the sunshine became a little bit of the metaphor of this character sort of at some point needing to look at herself more carefully.
Correct. I mean, you traverse from this bright outdoors to somber interiors, which mirrors the trajectory of the character herself, correct?
Yeah, we always thought that once we were inside, that could, even when it was daylight, that could feel quite moody and often almost like nighttime, but just because you're trying to keep the sunlight out.
In male-dominated crime thrillers, color is desaturated, and instead in your film, you do not desaturate the color. You add pinks, you add purples.
Right.
Can you tell us about?
Yeah, that's a great observation. It was funny when I was working. I was working with this amazing team of women, and my cinematographer, my costume designer, and my production designer would meet every week, and we would look at images, and we'd look at the costumes we were thinking about, and the fabrics, and the curtains, and the, sort of lens flare choices. And I kept showing everybody examples of a visual reference that had a lot of pink in it. And it was funny because my designer, Kay Lee, she said, it's funny because you keep saying you hate pink, but everything you show us has got a lot of pink in it. And so it made me realize that I actually found those pinks and purples really evocative in this kind of story. It seemed to have more emotional weight, those colors.
To me, it was almost disturbing. I mean, I'm thinking of the sequence where Petra and Belle are fighting, and the way that Petra is dressed, and the brick walls in the alley, and the blood. It is that pink and the red is disturbing.
Yeah. I think there's something about this movie and these characters, but also just I find myself in my work interested by ideas about femininity or femaleness that expand our definition of them and can sometimes bring elements of softness up against a kind of brutality that I think is unexpected.
And speaking of unexpected, we have this crime thriller, but then you add the mother-daughter aspect to it. Can you tell us about that layer to the story?
I mean, Phil Hay and Matt Manfredi, who wrote the, very complexly constructed and beautifully written script, didn't really feel like the story was worth telling if this character wasn't in a profound elemental relationship, particularly with a child. And because Erin is a mother, and there was just something about her getting a chance to sort of look at her younger self as a 16-year-old in Shelby, that was always meant to be, I think, the emotional through line of the whole movie is her making some kind of peace with her daughter, because really I think the movie is about moral accountability and taking some personal responsibility for your mistakes.
Yeah, correct. She's constantly confronting her mistakes and owning, and that's actually the part that I respect about her, that she has to own up to the mistakes that she's made.
Well, and it's so hard to do. I mean, when I think about, I have a son who's 11, and when he calls me out on something that he feels needs attention, it's very hard to say, you know what, I was wrong. And I know when I was a teenager, it was really hard to say to my parents, I was wrong. And so that parent-child relationship is so difficult to navigate, and in some ways the most treacherous, because somebody's young life is kind of at stake. And I think it took a lot of bravery for this character to acknowledge her wrongdoing.
I'm a huge fan of the 1970s cop films, Serpico, French Connection, but now you cast Belle. It's a female in that genre. Were you conscious that I am doing, that I'm doing a female take on those classic 70s?
I didn't really approach it like that. I mean, some of those movies are hugely important to me, and I get so much inspiration from them. But I didn't imagine that I was putting her in a male story or a male role. It was much more important to me that I find what made her tick, and she's complicated. She's complex, which I hope can be, a character trait that doesn't discriminate by gender, but obviously in some ways it has. And so I think for me, if we can expand the idea of the protagonist, of the anti-hero, and imagine more women occupying that space, I just think that's only a positive.
You've created, it's an incredibly complex character that you're showing us, but also the narrative itself. It is so complex, because you go from past to present, and you navigate both. Was that, how was that like working as a director?
I would say on a narrative level, this is probably the most complicated film I've ever tackled, only because there is so much information to try to absorb from it. And I know for myself, I watch movies, and sometimes some really big ideas kind of just fly over my head. And so I had to figure out, okay, what can we afford for the audience to miss? What is crucial that they absorb, even if it's over time? And that structural jumping back and forth in time, that was always in the script. It was always meant to have this kind of seamless quality of moving between the past and present, almost to the point where once you're in her head enough, you realize she sort of lives in both time frames. That was part of her despair, was she couldn't escape her past.
You mentioned how complex, and we've talked about how complex the character is, but she's not the most sympathetic character. And how challenging was it to find the emotional core of the character?
So that's a really good question. I mean, I think that was the key, was figuring out, okay, there are moments when she turns off most people in the audience, or turns me off while I'm watching her, but are there any rooting interests that we can keep alive that give the audience hope that they may see some step toward change, some small step toward transformation? And so that was the balance in the cutting room to really find between her legitimately alienating behavior and not shying away from that, because the last thing this character is sentimental. She's not a particularly there isn't much softness to her in that regard, but there is a lot of vulnerability that we start to see as the film wears on. We start to see that something is torturing her. And so I was just trying to keep a sense of mystery around the character that would keep the audience trying to understand how she got here. And I remain on the fence about to what degree I've succeeded in that for more people than not. But I felt like I had gotten to a place where I could accept this character's shortcomings and still want to see her succeed.
And this wasn't going to be my next question, but you alluded to the editing and how it must have been a really complex work to edit this
It was.
film.
We had to screen it a lot, and we would find that just taking out tiny little bits of information would completely shift the story for people in terms of just some of the reality in front of them, particularly around the mission in the past, the gang, going undercover with that gang. And so we had to find the balance of what's the minimum amount of information we can give everybody and still keep them grounded in what's happening, while kind of keeping the story, moving forward. It was a complicated post, and it was also just hard emotionally, because every time I would watch the movie, which is now, hundreds of times, I had to try to bear witness to this character afresh and just be open to what was happening emotionally. And she's not an easy person to hang out with day after day, hour after hour. And so that was part of, I think, that's part of what made the experience so challenging, was just to keep the mental and physical stamina. Somehow while sitting in the cutting room, I tore my rotator cuff, and I blame Erin Bell. The ghost of Erin Bell came in and ripped my shoulder from my body. I don't know how that happened.
Oh my God. But wasn't in the script always that the big reveal at the end that she's dying?
That she's dying.
Dying.
Yeah, that was always there. We were always meant to feel like that. This is the movie's inspiration kind of came for me from the experience of meeting people that that social decorum prevents us from saying, what's happening to you? You look like you're dying. Do you know what I mean? And there's an argument to be made that we're all dying, but there are some people who are dying a lot faster than others. And she's one of those characters where if we could be honest with her, we would say, what is wrong with you? What's happened? What is happening to you? But we don't do that as a culture. We give people their space. We don't want to intrude. We don't want to be impolite. And so this movie is saying, here's what happens when a person just lives alone in their shame, their guilt, their grief, their rage, and is sort of literally, initially even kind of metaphorically bleeding from the inside, but by the end of the movie, quite literally bleeding from the inside,
Nicole Kidman. How we've never seen her in this type of role. Why made you think that Nicole was the person for Belle?
It's funny because if Nicole were sitting here right now, I think it would be all the more astonishing, because she's very regal. She's almost 6 feet tall. She has perfect porcelain alabaster skin. It's not an easy fit. But when I first spoke to her about the role, she just talked a lot about guilt and shame, and how shame eats you alive, and how that's what she was connecting to in the character. And she was very open. She kept saying, I'm terrified of this part. I don't think I can do it. But I have to talk to you about it. And to have an artist of Nicole's stature being so open about her fear and being so open about a compulsion toward the material, I just felt like that's my kind of person. She's not saying I know exactly what to do and how I'm going to do it. She was saying, I want to go into a process with you to figure out what to do and how to do it. And I trust you to help me get there, and I got to trust myself that I can take the steps. And that's somebody who's just working at a very, very sophisticated level of her kind of creative path and process. And I just appreciated it so much. I felt like I was in the presence of a true artist.
Her phase, and you can tell us, is a combination of makeup and your choices and her acting. But in her phase, the passage of time, the regret, everything that you have spoken about the character, you actually see in her face.
Yeah.
And can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, it's funny because the basic kind of nut of the character is that she, grew up in the desert. She was sort of this desert rat kid who tried to sort of make her way into law enforcement and live on the straight side of the law. And I always just said to her, kind of woman to woman, I just said, imagine living in that environment and not putting on sunscreen for a day in your life. And like, that's really what we were going for, was like just truly sun damage. Like, Nicole, growing up in Australia, she was wearing sunscreen, since she was like 3 years old. And so and I guess skin cancer runs in her family, and so she has to be really quite careful about it. So it was kind of like our makeup artist had this blank canvas to work with to kind of paint the pigmentation and the liver spots and the sun damage that happens to all of us, but she let it happen to her a lot earlier.
But there's also a transformation that happens in the eyes as well.
Well, there's this like lack of light in her eyes, and that was what I loved about how she made the transformation to her younger self. She walked on set. I had already seen the makeup tests. I'd already been part of that process to get her to that younger look, and I was very confident that she would look pretty great, and she does. But what was more startling, really kind of like the voodoo of great acting, was she walked in and it was kind of like, oh, there's this like random beautiful 29-year-old walking around. Who is that? Like, the crew was astonished when she walked on, because she had yet again transformed kind of literally from the toes up. Mm-hmm. Through her whole body. She carried herself differently. Her voice was higher. I mean, she does so much in the present day that we sort of forget how much she has to do to play that flashback role. And so it was just really a pleasure to see an actor work from so many influences and draw from so many kind of her skill sets to create, those characters across time.
Mm-hmm. And the older Belle, she has a particular gait. She has a walk. Is that something that you work together with her?
Well, it's funny. I didn't specifically say, I think you should walk like this, but we did talk about the fact that she's, given the circular structure of the film, she's actually at her most injured at the very beginning of the movie as we're watching it. And so we wanted to figure out what that could look like and then be still a part of her usual gait. And I had just happened to, I live on the east side of Los Angeles, and I've been really obsessed with coyotes. There are more and more coyotes coming down into, away from the hills and into the lowlands. And we have a dog, and we used to have a small child, and I was always just like, I just don't want some coyote coming and like snatching my kid. And a friend of mine sent me this video drone footage of a pack of wild coyotes that were trapped in the Silver Lake Reservoir, kind of they wanted water, and then they were trying to get out, and they couldn't all get out together. And this drone footage just captured them frolicking and panicking and playing and then splitting off from one another. And I just sent it to Nicole. I just said, I don't know why, but I feel like these animals have something related to how you move. And she showed up on set, and I was just like, she's sort of got this like spirit animal of a wild broken cowboy coyote in her, you know.
And you do have the moment at the end where you actually show us the coyote and they look at each other. Yeah. Speaking of chameleons, Tatiana Maslany as Petra.
Yes.
Tell us about casting her and working with her on that role.
So I don't know if you guys are all familiar with Tatiana Maslany. She's a Canadian actor. She's sort of most well known for her roles in Orphan Black, the television show, in which she plays about 13 completely different characters. And it's just a masterclass in the craft of acting. I mean, she really is a brilliant, brilliant actor, and she's such a nice person. And I just thought, I feel like if Nicole is going to be Erin Bell, I need an actor who is sort of that young version of that skill level. And Tatiana was just somebody I've always wanted to work with, and the two of them just got along like gangbusters, even when Nicole kept throwing her into a trunk and shutting the door on her.
Jade Petti, who plays Nicole's daughter, she is the age of the character. And why did you cast somebody who's it added difficulty to the filming to cast somebody who is underage.
It did. It's hard to actually work with a 16-year-old, but just for all kinds of practical reasons. But it was so important to me that Erin Bell's daughter look like a 16-year-old kid, not a super grown-up 16-year-old kid, not even like, casting the movie, I met with wonderful actors, some of whom were 18, 19 even. And it's like they were already women. They already knew how to walk the red carpet. They already knew what flawless makeup looked like. They were already so mature. And I needed to find, Jade is incredibly mature, but she just had this quality of still being like, I could see the child in her. And I think that was so important, that the audience see in her face that she's still just out of childhood. Even though she says she doesn't remember it, we need to feel like this is what's at stake, this young person's life. And I hoped that would connect us to Erin's desire to try and save or salvage at least that one part of her life.
The set piece of the bank robbery, how difficult, fun was it to shoot that?
Well, Nicole had the flu during that entire week that we were doing that bank robbery. So I think speaking for her especially, but for all of us on the crew, it wasn't very fun. Everybody was going down from the same flu. So that was like one of those moments where it was like, oh, everyone's getting sick at the same time. The gaffer comes in and has 103 fever and we have to send him home. That kind of, it was just, I don't know if you remember last year's flu season was just so nightmarish. And so it really hit us hard. And it hit Nicole at the moment that we were filming our most difficult sequence in the movie, logistically. But it just made us work faster, more efficiently. I didn't waste takes to just noodle around. I just said, if we got it, let's move on. Let's save our energy before I go down,
But you do storyboard your films.
I do. And so for me, I used the fact that I'm very prepared when it comes to the action sequences to my advantage. I put all of the storyboards up on a big board so that the entire crew can see it. And then as we get those shots, we just put big X's through it, and at least the crew can walk past that whiteboard and say, okay, we're accomplishing something today. Let's just keep hustling. It's worth it. And so for me, that's a big part of the storyboarding process. It's not just what it brings me, but the sense that the crew can feel like we're not just sort of working in a vacuum. There is a sort of end in sight, even with these pieces, even with these sequences that require tons of little pieces.
Los Angeles is another character in the movie, and also the desert surrounding areas. Tell us about the working in Los Angeles and making it a character.
Yeah, it was really important to us to shoot in LA. I love living in Los Angeles. I think tragically, so much production has left LA that it was important to me to actually shoot in my home city and employ some of the greatest craftspeople in the world in their field, who should not be sitting at home without a job, or living in Atlanta. You know, like, I just feel like this is such a resource to be in LA. It's hard to shoot in LA, quite frankly, and this was a fairly low budget film for what it is. We shot it in 33 days. It was difficult, but it meant people got to go home to their families and have like almost a weekend, and we got to be in parts of LA that I've never seen before. And I feel like that was so exciting, to scout Los Angeles and really feel like I was, you know, kind of uncovering some of a hidden LA that hadn't yet been shot and hadn't been filmed before, and seen. So it was kind of a cool thing to imagine that we were sort of taking the audience on this odyssey into some corners of LA that are less well known.
And I think you've addressed a little bit, but I actually want to go back to it. The seamlessness between past and the present. Was that, you know, can you, talk about that? And was that a challenge? Did you shoot chronologically?
We didn't shoot chronologically. What we did was we shot all of the present day material first, because it was so physically demanding for Nicole, and just so mentally and emotionally demanding. And as I had this instinct that if we were to wait to shoot the flashback stuff, we would know a little bit better what we really needed, because we'd kind of seen how she developed the character for the present day. And what was just a sort of unexpected benefit was that by the time we got to shoot the flashback stuff, Nicole herself was so, kind of fighting depression, because that role was so demanding emotionally, that she got to sort of literally just change gears and be a slightly different person, still Erin Bell, but an Erin Bell that had some hope, that had love in her life, that had the thrill of potentially getting away with it. That was something that gave Nicole a little bit of a break. So we broke those two things up, and then as we put the film together, it was always scripted that it would be toggling back and forth between the present and the past.
Well, congratulations, Karyn, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.